Back in the 1930s, the tank was still a relatively new weapon. The masterminds of the world's most powerful tank forces were still debating about its role on the battlefield. Fits of paper fantasy showed engineers and designers putting on as much armor and as big of a gun onto a tank as their imagination could manage. The invention's power and potential seemed limitless to the minds of many, leading to the emergence of a type of heavy tank more akin to a land battleship. Most countries capable of building tanks were experimenting with their own models, from the British A1E1, Soviet T-35, to the German Neubaufahrzeug, to name the more practical designs. During the same time period, the Germans were building the infamous Siegfried Line, or Westwall, a fortified defensive line consisting of bunkers, tank traps, and much more arrayed along the western German frontier. Nothing in the French tank arsenal was able to challenge these potent defenses. Combining the multi-turret tank designs, in fashion at the time, and this new threat from the east, the French quickly realized they needed a new, powerful breakthrough heavy tank able to withstand anti-tank fire and destroy static defenses. With the doctrine of breaching the Siegfried Line in mind, a heavy tank program was requested by the Conseil Consultatif de l'Armement on the 4th of May, 1936. The specifications for this new program, named Char de Rupture 1937, or literally Breakthrough Tank, were released on the 12th of November, 1936. The Conseil Consultatif de l'Armement requested Char lourd, très protégé et très armé, propos particulier et utilisé offensivement dans les guerres en région fortifiée. Or, in English, a heavy tank, well armored and well armed, suitable for both defensive and offensive purposes in fortified battlefields. The tank was to have a maximum weight of 45 tons and dual armament, with a main gun in the hull and a secondary gun in a rotating turret. The vehicle would need thick armor, capable of resisting incoming fire from anti-tank field guns at a distance of at least 200 meters. Requirements for the mobility and speed of the design were tight, with a top speed of 30 kilometers per hour and a range of 200 kilometers or 10 hours. A few months later, in 1937, three French companies presented designs: AMX, ARL, and FCM. The Forge des Chantiers de la Méditerranée, or better known as just FCM, was a naval shipyard that specialized in heavy vehicles founded by the British engineer Philip Taylor in 1853. Besides building large warships like the Paris battleship, they had produced tanks and armored vehicles before, such as the FCM-36 and Char-2C. In May of 1937, FCM presented their first design for this competition. FCM was the last of the three to present a design, and it was the FCM F4 Variant A. The company already had plenty of experience in building large, heavy tanks, as 10 years earlier it had designed the FCM-2C, one of the largest tanks ever made. The company also proposed designs for the program that would eventually become the Char B1 in the form of the FCM-21. Variant A of the FCM proposal was based on their previous heavy tanks. It had a large Fusco conical turret located on the front of a long hull, with large idlers and drive sprockets beneath. Its suspension was typical of French heavy tanks of the time. On each side there were 8 bogies, with 1 leaf spring each. To each spring 2 road wheels were mounted. In addition, on each end of the track, there were 2 road wheels connected to bump stops for driving over rough terrain, such as trenches. They did not touch the ground, however. They helped minimize the impact when the tank first came in contact with an obstacle. The turret housed a 75mm gun, while a 47mm gun was mounted in the hull. This allowed for more effective usage of the 75mm, as it could cover an area of 360 degrees around the tank rather than being restricted by the limited traverse of a hull-mounted weapon. This, however, meant that a larger turret had to be made, pushing the height of the tank to over 3 meters. This turret was frusto-conical, typical of FCM turret designs of the era, and had a rotating cupola with a rangefinder on top. The 75mm gun had a designated gunner and loader in the turret, while the driver was in charge of aiming, shooting, and loading the 47mm. The commander was located in the center of the hull, so it might have been possible for him to assist the driver with loading the 47mm gun, but this is uncertain, as no plans of the crew layout exist. The overall weight would have been around 55 tons, far above the requirements. While ARL and AMX went with a traditional Char B1 layout of a 75mm howitzer in the hull and a 47mm gun in the turret, FCM went on its own path. Just like on the Char 2C, they mounted the required 75mm gun in the turret. It is unclear what 75mm gun this was supposed to be. Some sources claim it was the same as on the Char 2C, the model 1897 75mm howitzer, while others state the 75mm model 1929 would have been used. The APX 75mm model 1929 howitzer was a modified version of the model 1897 75 gun, with many components, such as the barrel, being the same. It was originally built for the Maginot Line as a static defense, but later modifications allowed it to be mounted on combat vehicles. The later tank destroyer projects ARL V-39 and the Soma SAU-40 were also equipped with this gun. Likewise, the designs of FCM's competitors ARL and AMX also mounted the newer howitzer in the hull. The ammunition used is unknown, however. The same guns in the Maginot Line used HE Model 1917 rounds with a muzzle velocity of 577 meters per second. Ammunition stowage for all the weapons is unfortunately also unknown. As secondary armament, FCM used the 47mm Model 1934 gun, firing APX MLE 1936 obus de rupture shells. Originally, just like the APX MLE 1929, this gun was intended for the Maginot Line. These shells had a muzzle velocity of 880 meters per second and could penetrate 77 millimeters of armor angled at 30 degrees at 500 meters, and 56 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. The shell weighed 1.67 kilograms and the charge weighed 610 grams. This gun would have been aimed and loaded by the driver. This was common in French tanks and was done to reduce the number of crewmen needed per vehicle. However, naturally, this put the crew under a lot of strain and required more training. In addition, maintaining the tank with a smaller crew was more strenuous. Version A was equipped with 2 machine guns, and these were the 7.5mm MAC Model 1931. Originally built for use in static defenses on the Maginot Line, it could also be mounted on tanks and other armored fighting vehicles. It was gas-operated and fired the 7.5mm MAS cartridge from a 150-round drum magazine. These rounds had a muzzle velocity of 830 meters per second. Its weight of nearly 12 kilograms meant that it had to be mounted on a heavy steel mount. There is very little information on the mechanical parts of the FCM design. It is known that it was to be equipped with 2 V12 diesel engines. It is unclear what engine this would have been, but may be assumed this engine was being purpose-designed for this tank project and got cancelled simultaneously. Each engine drove an electric generator that was connected to the final drive, similar to the later British TOG 1 and 2 and the German Elephant tank destroyer and the Maus super heavy tank. These engines were supposed to have allowed the 55-ton tank to reach 30 kilometers per hour. Like many other statistics about this vehicle, the armor thickness is mostly unknown. However, considering that the AMX design had 100mm at the front around the turret, it is relatively safe to assume that the FCM F4 would have had similar armor thickness. French tanks also tended to have the same armor thickness all around the turret. The frontal hull plate was well angled, and so was the turret, which increased its effectiveness. After presenting the first version, FCM showed a second one, the FCM F4 Variant B. It was identical, but had the transmission and exhaust moved centrally, and the FCM 36 turret equipped with 2 machine guns was added, facing the rear. This increased the weight to 57 tons and the crew to 5. There are no images of this design. In August of 1937, FCM proposed 2 new designs. Version C had a new turret, also armed with a 75mm gun. Version D had the 47mm gun in the hull, moved to the little turret in the back. In October, Version E was designed with 5 additional machine guns. Finally, in December, Version F was shown mounting a flamethrower, and the total weight was pushed to 59 tons. All 3 companies, ARL, AMX, and FCM, had their designs rejected because the tanks would have been too expensive and could only be produced in small numbers. Therefore, they would not have any large effect on the battlefield. To solve this, the Conseil Supérieur de la Guerre decided on the 26th of March 1937 to build a smaller and cheaper yet heavily armored tank. However, after testing, the Section de l'Allemand et des Études Techniques claimed that this would be redundant as there was already such a tank under development, the Char G1. Due to this evolution, the requirements were changed in February of 1938. There was to be no weight limit, and a 75mm gun had to be mounted in the turret. The same companies presented designs once again. However, these new specifications were very close to those of the original FCM design, so the Supreme Command gave FCM a contract to build the tank. This would eventually lead to the FCM F1, a 140-ton monster with 2 massive turrets and a 90mm gun. However, by the time a mock-up was ready in 1940, France had been occupied by Germany, and consequently, all super heavy tank designs were halted, meaning no French charlotte would ever get the chance to batter the Siegfried Line.